Hello and welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin Tizik. On this episode, I'm joined by Gwen Lafage, who is the VP Marketing, Global Brand, and Content at Sinch. And we're talking about all things brand, but specifically, we really focus on what brand actually means, some of the common misconceptions around it, and how to create a strong and brave brand that actually stands out. On to the episode. Hey, Gwen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So today we're going to talk about a topic a lot of people talk about, but I feel like everyone understands it a little bit differently or has their own definition, which is brand. And specifically how, especially today, you said a strong, brave brand to stand out. So we'll get into what that is. But I think maybe before that, let's get into your definition of what brand means. Because to me, it varies. Non-marketing people think it's colors, logos, and fonts, which drives me insane. But I'm sure to you, it's a lot more. So yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I think to me, it's what people know about you, right? Like it's your reputation, it's what they think about you or think who you are. In a nutshell, I think that's what brand is. And that's why it's tricky, I think, as a marketing concept, because if you think about it as your reputation, you don't fully own it as a company, right? It's what other people think about you. So how you influence that is what brand marketing or the role of a brand person in a company is.
Yeah, and I find it's a little bit easier. Say you work at Pepsi or Coke or something where you have those brand association tests that you're running with, I don't know,
Right.
50,000 people. But for
Yep.
companies maybe our size or in tech, like you said, it's a little bit harder to measure. But before we get there, let's maybe talk like how to measure it. Let's talk a little bit about, you said you need a strong, brave brand. And I agree from the point of having to stand out and differentiate because it's really easy to spin up a website, do some ads, and look like everyone else. So
Right.
maybe let's
Yep.
unpack that. Like when you're thinking about how I want to stand out in my reputation, how do you figure out where to start there?
I think you want to start by trying to nail down how you want people to perceive you. If we think it's perception, you can first define yourself as a company or as an individual. We took personal brand or like a company brand. In a way, it's like very much of the same. It's what do you want people to think about you when they see you, hear you? What do you want people to remember about you? And I think that's where you should start. So you should start by like those foundation. And when we are in marketing, we talk about brand foundation, brand positioning, brand narrative, all of these kind of together, value proposition, like all of these kind of elements in marketing comes down to what do you want to be known for and what do you want people to remember, whether you're a big company or a small company. And then obviously a brand like Pepsi or Coke and Nike, like they have done that from a really long time. So we have a lot of perception, a lot of like association that we can make hearing those brands or about those brands. We all have images that comes to mind when we think about those brands. And that's where you want to start, even if you're small. What do you want people to remember? When you start up or when you start off, it will probably be much closer to your product. You want to make sure that people understand what you do and that like they associate you with what you're selling. I think that's a bit of a misconception sometimes of brand that you see that it's a big, bold kind of story. Yes, it's true. You want to build that emotional connection, but if it doesn't come to mind what you sell, you're missing the point, right? Or then people remember a logo and a color and they have no idea what you do.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a problem because ultimately the role of brand is also to drive revenue, right? And like we all here, and I guess in marketing a company, marketing is about like selling or opening doors for sales and facilitating sales. And I think the more you know, the more it will be easy to sell and open those doors. The bigger you are, the biggest brand you have, it's like a bit of a chicken and egg, right? Like you become bigger, your brand becomes bigger, you're more known, it gets easier. At the beginning, you do need to try to appear bigger than you are. And I think brand and marketing can help definitely do that.
Yeah, I think really good point there is the clarity of like people understanding what you do because sometimes I think when people think brand, they get almost like a little too cute with it.
Hmm.
Like they talk in roundabout ways and maybe a little bit more
Yeah.
flowery, or they tell a longer story. And I can think of a few companies, I won't name them, where I see them all over. I see their brand. I have no idea what they do,
What
but
they
they've
do.
got me to recognize their name,
And
which
I
doesn't
think
help me.
it's like it's also a way to start if you see them everywhere, and even if you don't know exactly what they do, if you start maybe being like feeling connected to what they say and what they stand for, it's a
Mhm.
way to get started, right? Like it's also a way to get started. They stand for hopefully for something, unless you only see ads, but often on LinkedIn, I think that happen a lot. On you maybe see a lot of people working at those companies and they become influencers and you're like, oh, they're great. They talk a lot about this and that. At least they start to building associations on, oh, this guy talks a lot about sales. And it happened that the company is a sales listening tool. I don't know. They might be usually a link between what they talk about. And I think it builds up on each other, but it's about building this association. And I think the building that connection is important, explaining what you do is important, and brand is shaping that perception, right? So
Mhm.
if you like the person, it's the first step towards getting closer to the brand, right? So I think it's all of the thing that we can do within a company and especially as marketers or brand marketers to influence that perception and bring the awareness, right? So there's the awareness and then you want to become a voice in a certain space. So it's the soul leadership. It's like all of those elements that are encompassed between, for me, the term brand.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's all like the tangible ones you mentioned previously, like positioning, messaging, all that sort of stuff. There's also this almost weird and tangible of just like the general vibe of the brand, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. It's a
Yep.
nebulous thing I'm throwing
Yep.
out there, but there's certain companies where I see an ad or I even read two sentences from them. I'm like, oh, that's company X.
Right.
Is that a function of repetition or just them having their brand so dialed in that it's built those associations?
I would say it's both because repetition is really important. Repetition and consistency is really
Mhm.
important in building the brand and understanding what or making people remember who you are. And then I think it's also in this case, they probably have a really good foundation and probably a really like brand voice or like tone of voice that you can associate to them. I would say that with like a brand voice or like the just the copy, it's a really hard thing to do. It's really
Mhm.
hard to like take the logo, read a few pieces of copy, and nail it who it's from. I think that means that it's a company that have really done a great work at defining their brand voice. It's probably more common, and yet in B2B is not that common that you take the logo and we recognize colors or like the design and like some kind of brand assets. It's a bit more common, but I know they've done like many studies, and I think it's the B2B Institute that have done studies on analyzing do people recognize different assets and even the well known brand in B2B, the number of people that recognize it is very low. And even for brand that we will say, oh yeah, I know that brand really well. The Salesforce, Slack, like Oracle, maybe like
Mhm.
Adobe, like Microsoft, like you take the brand name and it's you might have an idea of who the brand is, and sometimes you would know. I think like Salesforce probably have done a pretty good job at that. If you see like some of the mascots, right, you
Yeah.
will say automatically that style is Salesforce and it's nobody else, whether we like it or not, is recognizable. But there's a tendency in B2B to follow trends. And so you see all the brands doing the same thing visually.
Mhm.
And yes, it look cool and trendy and it's like on point or modern, but then the distinction is really hard to make from one brand to another. They all start looking the same. So this distinctiveness and distinctive assets is a really important part of building a brand. It's
Yeah.
pretty difficult to do.
It is. Yeah, like we saw that I think a few years ago where they had every website had those kind of elongated people on them, like pointing
Yep.
to the I think Intercom was probably one of the first I noticed that did it and did it well, but
Hmm.
then every website had that. But I think you make a good point that it's this longer term repetition to stand out. Like you can show me a photo from a Nike ad with no logo and it's just because of the way the picture is, you're like, yeah, that's Nike. And I don't know if we
Right.
can get there from a B2B perspective, but one thing I think
Yeah.
that's if you're Salesforce and you have $300 billion or whatever they have,
Yeah.
possibly. But one thing I think that comes up a lot with brand, and you mentioned its reputation, which I totally agree with, is sometimes because it's reputation, people play it maybe a little too safe. Like they're
Yep.
afraid of not even offending people, but like excluding people or wanting to be for everyone. So, how do you view that from a brand perspective? Should you feel a little bit uncomfortable with some of the things you're doing with your brand?
Yes, I think like it's important for brands to think outside of the box, try to play out the creativity to stand out. I think that's something we don't do enough in B2B. And the other thing is having a point of view, right? I think a lot of B2B brands probably don't have a strong point of view where it's maybe easier as a B2C brand, or like we know Nike and like they have really strong point of view on certain social topics. So we definitely like whether we like it or not. And they like are not afraid of, yeah, be likable by some people and not by others and move away some people from them. I think that's something we not very few tech companies, I think, like or B2B companies are able to do. I will say it's harder when you're a B2B company because
Yeah.
you don't have that much opportunities, but it doesn't prevent you from having a strong point of view. Maybe not on social aspects, because that's not really what you ask of a software company. No one really cares. I think like the software that you buy for your company is like pro this or pro that, right? I don't think that's where there's a biggest place to play in B2B, but in your space and in what you're selling, and it's like where the market is going, and like think that is impacted the way people work, it's important to have a point of view. Like AI, for example, right? Like every single company right now in tech have like all in AI. It's okay, great, but not a lot of them has an actual point of view on what do you see the future being and what is your company doing to get there? How are you using it beyond just like better writing features? So I think this idea that having a strong narrative really start by try to have a real point of view, and it gets a lot easier for people in the companies and new founders and new CEO or like to share their thoughts and get position if they have a big point of view. I think a lot of positioning expert will talk about have an enemy. I'm like, ah, yeah, sometimes, not maybe always, but it helps. It's
Mhm.
one tactic, I will say, to do it. That works quite well because then people know what you're against and then they can position you somewhere, right? Like I think Salesforce again, like really started that way, which like the no software.
Yeah.
And so I think is a great tactic. They had a really strong point of view.
Yeah, I find I've got that advice from positioning people too, and I think it's because there's some of those B2B stalwarts who did it so well. Like HubSpot's another one with inbound marketing, or Drift being anti-form, or like you said,
Mhm.
Salesforce in the cloud. But that's it's like capturing lightning in a bottle. Like that is remarkably hard to do. I've been in I don't know how
Really
many
hard.
meetings
Yep.
coming up with what's our version of that, and it's hard. So part of it is, like you said, the general reputation and what you stand for. You maybe don't always need that perfect strategic narrative to
Mhm.
get started. And I find people maybe get hung up there, and then their narrative changes every 6 months, and then you don't get that repetition, and then no one knows what you do or who you stand for.
Yeah, it's tricky because it's you want that narrative to be relevant for your audience and be relevant for your company and be strong and unique enough that like you stand out with it. And it's n- really, yeah, it's really difficult. And sometimes you realize that actually maybe we went too far. And
Yeah.
so I'm always for having a really good positioning and having a point of view, at least a direction when that helps frame your content in that way. But
Mhm.
in practice, and when you produce content for a company, it's a very complex exercise. And also to stick to it. And not all of your content needs to be about defending your point of view because you want to
Mhm.
also educate the market on certain stuff. So I think there's the ideal of what we would want to have, and then the reality of working with all those elements and all of the marketing tactics out there and doing demand gen and SEO. And so
Yeah.
when you have to play on many different level where you cannot maybe have your narrative front and center in every single thing you write or talk about.
Yeah, like running a Google ad for your category. You're not going to be able to squeeze in your narrative, right? They give you 100 characters. Yeah, and I think on that point to transition there is I find sometimes depending on the company, getting buy-in to do some of those longer term brand exercise or brand deposits essentially, like you're putting money in the bank
Mhm.
really and building up your brand, sometimes get put on the back burner for those quick wins like spinning up
Right.
an outbound program, running Google ads. But what I think maybe some execs don't realize is it's way easier to show ROI on a Google ad, just to use that example, if people actually know your brand. So how do you
Yeah.
think through and position that to get people to take that long-term view?
It's interesting because in an ideal situation, you would like to spend the time to like really make all those foundation and establish this foundation, then to build your brand and put like money behind that before you do the quick win and get like fast ROI. But the reality is that you usually need to get that fast ROI and money in the bank to do the long term stuff.
Yeah.
So you do need to like first prove in marketing that you're delivering and that you building a pipeline before as a new, let's say as a new CMO and or a new VP of marketing, your first thing should probably not be like, oh, let's rebrand when you arrive
Hmm.
in a company, right? It's first get those quick wins, show your CEO that marketing is stable, marketing is delivering. Then you'll have a bit more, I think, freedom to do those long term projects. And you probably know those long term projects will help the short term. But the reality is, especially right now in this market, that everyone needs to deliver on short term. And it's hard because that means that it needs to be a focus, right? And I'm not, even as a brand marketer, I won't deny that. Like it definitely needs, you need to put money in the bank of the company right now. Otherwise, you're not going to be there in business next year. So it's great to say, yeah, but this will make us much better next year. Yeah, but you might not be there. So you
Yeah.
first need to like be there to be able to do it. So it's always a balance between doing both in parallel. And so trying to carve enough time and bandwidth and desire from the company to build those foundation while you're doing the fast short-term stuff, because it shouldn't be one or the other, right? And I think it's also misconception that like the foundation and the brand is never done and finished. Like it needs to also evolve.
Hmm.
So using demand gen and performance to test some stuff as you do the work is probably a great way to mix them both and to continue testing until you get to a place where it makes sense and you're happy with it. And so I think they both serve each other, right? When it will be established, your demand gen efforts will probably work better. Yourself will work better when you have more brand awareness, but they also help build the brand, right? So
Yeah.
in a way, I also feel like the demand gen and all the performance marketing, like it does help the brand. It's we try to position them against each other, but the reality is they're just two part of the same activities, right? It's they just different ways of approaching it from both with the same goal. I think they work really well together if you stop trying to have them compete.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a key point there too is getting those quick wins, especially when you're new to an organization. Cause
Hmm.
pretty much without fail, anytime I've started as a marketing leader at a company, there is some area that company isn't great at that you can get a quick win at. Like maybe their paid
Right.
efforts were poor and you can come in and that's
Yeah.
going to be that incremental gain.
Right.
Most of those companies, say you go from 10 to 100 mil, you're probably not going to do that with those incremental gains. And I think that's where the brand plays and those longer term plays come in that compound over a couple of years. The downside
Yeah.
is a lot of marketers don't last long enough to see that
Yeah.
come to fruition, sadly. But
Yeah.
that kind of goes with the territory.
Yeah, no, that's true, and I think it's a question of mindset as well. I think what at Sinch, so like where I'm a VP of brand, and with my team, we work on a lot of different type of projects from campaigns. So we'll
Mhm.
call them like brand gen campaign or performance branding campaign,
Yeah.
where we think about them as full funnel, where we will work on like a campaign that will be implemented in the regions. We're a pretty large company, so we have like local marketing teams in regions, and like we deliver global brand campaign that they can implement. But we work very closely with them to make sure that what we deliver will hit all the different needs that they have, from like awareness to conversion. And so some ads and some like element of the content that we're producing will serve as different purposes. And I think it's together they make this consolidated approach that serves as building the brand, and they may be more creative than like a usual kind of demand an ad. But then some of those ads are more focused on delivering a lead or an intent right now, versus some are more to drive visibility, but they all work together. So together they build the brand, and it's like that kind of full funnel approach. Then we also do a lot of like content and things that are maybe hard to measure, but we know are essential both to build a brand and, again, reassure, proof point work on a lot of customer stories right now, for example. And I think there's no better stories about your company than the one told by your customers. And I think, so those customer stories, like I know that people think about them, oh yeah, they like conversion, or they more middle bottom of the funnel. And I'm like, are they though? Because they're also building your brand, right? So they can be used in different ways. So I think it's stop thinking about, is this asset or is this thing brand awareness or is it like conversion? And maybe the content can do both and it's the same content. So we've tried to put framework with this funnel and this mindset, which is not really the reality of how people buy anyway. So people might watch the customer stories before they know what you do and who you are, right? That might be how they learn about what you do. So I think it's important to stop thinking about those barriers and try to be a bit more holistic on how we approach marketing and content and brand.
Yeah, I think especially if like we go way back to the start of the conversation when you said it's reputation and what people are saying about you.
Mm-hmm.
Customer content is essentially that. You can talk about your own brand enough. Like even G2 reviews, for example, I don't put a ton of weight in the individual review because they usually don't say much. They all sound the same. But at the same time, if I look at a company and they have a 2 out of 5 on G2, probably not going to talk to that company. So
Right.
I agree. Like people look at that stuff first. It's funny. Our most successful LinkedIn ad campaign is actually, we're a customer testimonial company. So of course it's customer testimonials, but same thing. We use that to build reputation and get out front. The one final question I want to get your thoughts on, and neither of us is really in this space, but I find it's the hardest position to be in as a marketer to build brand, is when you are actually in a completely new category where there's not existing demand to siphon off. And in that point, it seems almost like a pure brand play because you can't get those quick wins, right? So say you're plunged into a new role, completely new product, completely new category. How would you tackle that problem?
I will say that at the beginning, especially if you're a startup, I think it will depend of like the size of the company and the budget that you have. But if you're a startup, and I think a lot of companies or startups feel like, we're building this new category. It doesn't exist. And the safest thing and probably the smart thing to do at the beginning is not to go and try to create a completely new category, is to associate yourself to an existing one.
Yeah.
Because in people's mind, and they need a framework, they need something to understand what you do. And it needs to start from a point of reference that they get, right? So you probably want to start by associating yourself by something familiar. It's easier and it requires a lot less time and less money than going all in on this, start to create this new category. And I'm saying category creation is relevant and definitely like important. I see it as like unique positioning in a way. I think associate yourself with something that is known and then over time start to differentiating to define how unique you are and why it's new, and maybe start giving a new name at that point. But I think the naming of the new category and trying to go all in on that, if you're saying we're so different from everybody else, I found that like a lot of companies in tech especially do that, when in reality, there's not that unique and different. And so if you put yourself in the buyer's shoes, they will get to you because they have a need. And if they don't have a need, then, well, it's going to be really hard. Like you need to solve a specific problem. And chances are that there are already companies that are trying to solve that same problem. Not saying maybe you can succeed better than them, but owning on the problem so that you can become the solution. And I think that's how I would recommend it. Find the point of reference, maybe enter an existing category, explain how you're solving the problem. And I think that's the way to go about it at first. Yeah, because category creation is really tough, require a lot of energy, a lot of money, a lot of resources, especially if you really want to build that category from scratch. And also there's a lot of misconception. What does it mean? What's a category? Do you want like a new G2 quadrant thing, or is it like an analyst perception of a category, or it became like a very tricky things to discuss, I feel like, where I understand the idea of going into a kind of a blue zone, right? Trying to be somewhere there's no competition. But I think it's no competition in your niche. So you can associate it with something and then niche down into something. It's okay, we're a CRM, but we're not really a CRM. We're actually a CRM that has this unique feature that we realize maybe work better for lawyers. So we are a CRM for lawyers, and that's our category. And there's no one else there because all the other CRMs are CRMs, right? But then you niche down and you own that market. So I think that's the way I'm seeing it a bit more. I'm trying to niche down and claim a hill that you can own and no one else can. So it's really a positioning exercise in a way, and being very clear on what you sell, who you sell to, and what problem you're solving.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, because if I was looking at a company and they said, "Oh, we have no competitors, we're this new thing," I would wonder, is there demand? Will people actually buy this? And all those category creation companies did what you said. Drift was really live chat, but they attached themselves to this anti-forms message, and they were live chat but for sales and stuff, so you actually get results. Or HubSpot, similar thing with CRM. So I think that's a key point, because I like the concept of category creation, but I agree with what you're saying, that it's not, you can't just make up some random thing and hope if you build it they might not come, right? There needs to be demand.
Exactly. No, and I think that's the thing, is I like the concept of category creation as well. I think what's relevant with it is this idea of being unique and going towards something that no one else is going after, and positioning you in a way that no one else can say they do the exact same thing. I think that's really important. But whether or not it's really creating a category, and it's debatable, I think.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you want it to be very much of a category and need to a lot of press and analyst relation and all of that stuff, then it becomes quite complex. I do feel that it comes down to the distinction, right? You do need to have a strong differentiator. And so that's what a drift of those companies we've discussed have done, is trying to position themselves as something else and maybe start naming it something else at some point. But I feel like it's a good way to win, but it doesn't mean that you have no competitor, because in reality, when they're trying to solve a problem, clients or companies will look at several solutions, and they don't care if you call yourself revenue platform or intelligence blah. They don't really care what the thing is called. Is this solving my problem? Then they're trying to get down into it. It's a way, again, to have a strong narrative. And I think for that, yes, there is benefits in having that strong, solid narrative and positioning.
Yeah, exactly. It all boiled down back to the basics that we discussed at the start, right? It always comes back there. So I know we covered a ton of topics there. I know you talk about this stuff, a lot of other stuff on LinkedIn. You're pretty active there. But if people want to connect, learn more about you or your company, where should they go for that?
Yeah, they should definitely search for me on LinkedIn. Like you said, I'm quite active, up and downs, depending on the weeks. But I'm always there, and I try to be responsive when people reach out. My company is Sinch.com, SINCH. We are a customer communications cloud, and we help companies connect with their customers. I think that's the short version. But yeah, they can find more on our website, but feel free to connect with me. And I do talk a lot about brands and how and why it's important. So if that's a topic that interests people, feel free to reach out.
Perfect. So for our listeners, I'll include those links. And Gwen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode. My key takeaway is just Gwen's point about how easy it is to, spin up a website, do some ads, and just look like everyone else. If you combine that with how much easier it gets every year to create software, given the advancements in AI and all of that, it means that brand is going to continue to be your strongest differentiator. And really, the simplest way to boil it down is think about your brand as your reputation and then work on building that reputation with the right people. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, drop us a 5-star review. We always love those, or hit follow on Spotify. And as always, I'll be back on Tuesday with a new episode.